Hey there, are you building a Next.js application and need to understand its data fetching capabilities better? If so, you've come to the right place. My name is Otto, and in this video, we're going to take a look at Next.js's static generation and server-side rendering capabilities, as well as learn when and how to use these strategies in building our applications. Let's dive right in. Alright, so let's get started. Here I am on the Next.js homepage, and I'm quickly going to go to the docs and data fetching section and take a look at the three new methods that were introduced back in Next.js version 9.3. If you're using a prior version like Next.js 9.2 and below, you might be familiar with another method for static and server-side rendering called getInitialProps. And that method is on its way to being deprecated and not used anymore. And the Next.js team recommends using one of these three new methods. And the three new methods introduced are getStaticProps, getStaticPaths, and getServerSideProps. Now the first two are used for static page generation, and the last one is used for server-side rendering. And I think it makes more sense to take a look at the server-side rendering method first, because it's a little bit easier to conceptualize and it might be something that you're already familiar with. So the getServerSideProps method is going to fetch data on every single request we make. So every single time we refresh the page, the getServerSideProps method is going to be activated, it's going to run, get our data, and feed it to our component. And we would use this method on any page within our Next.js application that needed to get data before rendering the component. Now for the example application, rather than starting from scratch, what I think I'll use is an application that a good friend of mine, Ryan Schenke, and I have been working on called speak.dev. So I already have a repo up and running here with a bunch of different pages, a bunch of different features and functionalities. And in this video, we're just going to focus on how we can use this application and how we can use the data fetching capabilities of the Next.js framework. And what we're going to focus on is this events directory right here, which is in our pages directory, and it has two different files. Index, which is going to be the main page that gets loaded up when we run our application, and then this brackets ID page, which is going to be the dynamic page for an individual event that is going to be fed dynamically based on the route that we provide. So if we open up this index.tsx file, we see that is just going to render some data based on an events prop that we pass into it. We're not doing anything fancy here. We are just rendering some data. And the way that we're going to populate that props element is using our getServerSideProps Next.js method. And you can see here on line 48, we are running export async function, getServerSideProps, and then we are getting our data from a GraphQL helper that I've written. And if we take a look at the query here, we're going to go into our database, get our events, and then just get the ID, the name, and the URL of the event. And then that data is going to be populated onto our props.events object and then sent into our events component. So if I start this application, I'll say npm run start. That's going to take a couple of seconds. Once our server has started, we'll be able to navigate into localhost 3000 /events, and we're going to see our events. And currently we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 events. Now, when it comes to the getServerSideProps method, this method is going to run every time we refresh the page. So on every page load, on every page refresh, this getServerSideProps method is going to run. It's going to make this database, this GraphQL call to our database, populate it, and then render the data. And we can see that here. We have our elements, and everything works great. And then if we click into any of them, so let's say ngconf, for example, here, we see the events and then the ID for it, so the unique identifier, and that's going to load up our specific event information. Now let's take a look at where our data is coming from. all of the data is coming from MongoDB. So I have a MongoDB database set up on MongoDB Atlas with this collection, with this database called speak.dev, this events collection, and then here is our list of events. So because every single time we render this page, we make a call to our database. If we were to make an update, let's say we wanted to rename one of the events. So let's say ngconf 2021 gets renamed to maybe even some React. We'll hit update. So our data in our database is now updated. When we go back into our application, refresh the page, we are going to see that new information updated. And the reason for this is because every time we refresh our page, we are making a brand new call to MongoDB to get that remote data, loading it into our component, and then re-rendering it to the screen. So this is essentially how the getServerSideProps method works. All the code you write in it is going to execute every single time you refresh the page or you reload that route. Now, a reason you may not want to use getServerSideProps is that every single time you reload a page or every single time a specific page is loaded with getServerSideProps, it's going to run that Lambda function, or it's going to, make a call to your backend, make a call to the database. So if you have data that doesn't change often from the database, making that call continuously just kind of seems wasteful. So that's why Next.js also supports this getStaticProps function, which relies on static generation. And if we look at the docs here, it fetches data at build time. So it's going to go, so what this is going to do is it's going to make a call to the database when we build the application, when we deploy it, when it's first built. It's going to get that data and render it once and make that information static so that we don't have to make a continuous call to the database back and forth every single time we reload the page. And we can see how this works by going into our code and changing the getServerSideProps to getStaticProps. We'll hit save. It's going to update our application. So now if we go back into our app here, we'll refresh, make sure everything still works. And if we go and change some of the data, so I'm going to just remove what I had previously. We'll leave it as ngconf 2021, hit update. Now when we reload the page, we are actually seeing the change. And the reason for this is both the getServerSideProps and getStaticProps are going to run every single time when you're in development mode. So let's go ahead and restart our server, but this time we're going to run it in actual production mode. So I'm going to run npm run start rather than npm run dev. And what this is going to do is it's going to run the application as it were in production from the build directory rather than building it every single time we make a change. So now if we go into our application and navigate to localhost 3000 events, refresh the page, it's going to load up really quickly, and we have ngconf 2021, MongoDB world, etc., etc. But if we go into our database and change some of the information, so let's change ngconf again to something else, update it. Now if we go back into our application, reload, we are not going to see that change reflected. So even though in our database we have ngconf 2021 something else, in our application, because we are using getStaticProps, we are not getting the updated data. So the data was generated and pre-rendered once. The data is going to be rendered once, and unless we specify how often we want that data to be refreshed, it's going to remain static. So even though we're making changes in our database, we are not going to see those changes reflected in our Next.js application. Now to fix that, all we need to do is go into our application here, and after returning the props, we're also going to pass in a second element, and that element is going to be called unstable revalidate, and then how often we want to update the information in our application. So let's say we want it updated. Let's just say we want to update it every second. So what this is going to do is it's going to render readily available information that we have, and then it's going to go ahead and refetch new information from the database so that on next reload, every second here, we're going to get the latest and most updated data. So here I just put 1 second so that we can see the explanation, so that we can see what happens. But in a real world application, you might set this to every minute or every 10 minutes if the data, if you're not expecting the data to be updated often. So let's go ahead and rebuild our application and see what happens now. So I'm going to stop this. I'll run npm run build to build a new version of it, and then we're going to start it in production again. Let's go back into our application now, refresh, and we're going to see the changes from earlier. So we have something else spelled wrong, and then MongoDB World 2022 instead of 2021. Whoops. So now, if we go back into our MongoDB Atlas cluster and change some of the data, so let's fix ngconf 2021, remove the other information from it, we'll hit update. If we were to immediately refresh, we're not going to see the changes. But if we give it a couple seconds, give Next.js time to go and refetch and revalidate that information, then we're going to see the updated info. So this kind of gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you both the ability to prefetch data and have it load super quickly when your application is loaded, but also when data changes on the back end, that you can get that latest data and have it displayed as well. So we talked about getServerSideProps and getStaticProps, but there's one more method that we need to discuss, and that is getStaticPaths, which is also related to static generation. And what this method does is it's going to tell Next.js which dynamic routes to preload and pre-create pages for. Now, to see how this works, let's go into our code and open up this brackets ID file. Now, this component is very similar to our index component in that it's just going to render some information about an event, and in this case, rather than rendering all of the events, it's just going to render one specific event. And here what we are using is the getStaticPaths method, which is going to go into our MongoDB database and get a list of all of the IDs which we're using for our slugs, or for our URL parameters for our Next.js application. And we are mapping all of those to a variable called paths, and then returning those paths with a fallback set to true. And then we are combining the getStaticPaths method with the getStaticProps to actually go ahead, get that parameter ID, get our data, and update it like we would. And in this method, we are also using the unstable revalidate set to 1, so that if we do make changes to our data, it is successfully reflected. Now, why do we need the getStaticPaths method? The reason that Next.js provides this method is when we have dynamic pages that we want to generate, we need to know what those URLs are going to be. And this getStaticPaths method is going to take care of that for us. Now, to see how this works, I'm going to export my Next.js application so that we can see what HTML files get generated when our application is built. So if I were to run npm run export, it's going to build and create essentially a static version of my site in a directory called out. And we're going to be able to see the pages that getStaticPaths is automatically going to generate for us. And this is going to fail because I'm trying to combine server-side props and static props. So, this application wouldn't run, but I do want to see what gets generated. So if we look at this out directory and look at the events, we can see that for each event, we have an HTML document that was created that is minified, but we can see the content for it. So for every document that we had in our MongoDB database, so we had 6 documents here, we also have a statically generated page for it with all of the HTML, all of the visual elements. And this is what Next.js would do for us if we were to build and deploy this application to production on Vercel or a different platform. So that is why we use this getStaticPaths to figure out which static paths we need to generate, and from there we let Next.js handle everything else for us. Now we also have this fallback property that we need to return with the getStaticPaths method. Tell Next.js what to do in the event that a page was not pre-rendered at build time. So if we set it to true, what's going to happen is when we get a URL, so if we were to do events and pass in a object ID for a new event, for example, that hasn't already been pre-rendered, then Next.js is going to run the getStaticProps method on it and generate that data. Otherwise, if we set it to false, then we're just going to get an error saying that, that page doesn't exist. So let's see how this works. So I have this fallback set to true, and let me go ahead and rerun my application. So what we're going to do is let's go into our MongoDB Atlas cluster and let's create a brand new event that doesn't already exist. So if we go into our events page, we see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different events. Now, if we go in here, let's create a new one. So we will insert a document and we'll give it a name of Next.js World. Insert that document and it should be here. Let's get its object ID and try to navigate to that page. What we're going to see is Next.js World is successfully rendered because we had set that fallback property to true. But if we were to set it to false, let's say false, and let me restart, so I'll have to rebuild and restart. Let's run npm start. So now we can go into our application, into the event section, and we see our 7 different events. If we go and create a new one, and we'll call it React World. Let's copy its ID. Now remember, since we set the fallback to false, we're going to get an error. And the reason that we're getting this error is because we set that fallback property to false, meaning that if we didn't already generate the page when we built the Next.js application, we're going to ignore all other pages and we're not going to try to do anything else. Now, the last thing to keep in mind about these 3 methods within Next.js is that all of these methods only run on the server. So both getStaticProps, getServerSideProps, and getStaticPaths will never be sent to the client. And the big benefit of this is that now you can run server-side code that you would traditionally delegate to the API folder within Next.js directly within the getStaticProps and the getServerSideProps methods. So you can do all sorts of really unique things here. So things like if we take a look at our speak.dev project, within here we are getting the user session server side, getting their information, getting stuff that we wouldn't want to expose to the client, executing it within this getServerSideProps method, and then just passing it in as static props to our Next.js component. We could even bring in, our MongoDB client and run queries directly here, exposing our connection string and not worry that it's going to be exposed to the client side and potentially exposed to the world. And we can also validate that this code is never sent to the client side by checking this Next.js code elimination project that tells us what is going to be bundled and sent to the client side. So in this example here, we have this getServerSideProps method, and this method is making a SQL request. So it's talking to a SQL database, getting its information and populating it to this project's prop. But this server-side prop, all of this code is never sent to the client. So I hope this video was helpful in explaining the data fetching capabilities of Next.js, the static generation and server-side rendering capabilities, how they work, and when you would want to use one over the other. I hope you found the video useful, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Otherwise, I will see you next time.